This is turn 41 of Degeneracy. So first we have this 2-black appear and attack our Shadow Tribune. He's able to successfully hit it with Lemuria's Control Undead Holy Spell, but unfortunately he doesn't get to keep his pet 2-black given that it goes away at the end of the fight. Here in Shepherd's Haven, we successfully raid a province from Mictlan, losing only a few dispossessed spirits in the process, and because Mictlan had a Jackal Warrior retreated into there, we managed to kill him as well. The same is true in Valador, with us killing 4 of these Jaguar Warriors that had retreated in, and losing only these dispossessed spirits, which we really don't care about. Here in Jaburnia, Agartha is just raiding a province with a bunch of reanimators and some troop support. Here in Ungbalath, Mictlan is raiding a province back with just a small group of Sacreds. In the Cracked Earth, we get to see Agartha's large army in action. It looks like he was actually planning on hitting some of our actual troops, and as a result, he put these Flame Barrel Nightmares in the front. So these guys are horses which explode when they die, which is their whole appeal. They're relatively quick, which means they're able to get into the fight fairly quickly, so it's kind of like having just an explosion. Having them spread out like that both increases the spread which they can hit and is going to help reduce the chance that they're hitting each other. However, because he's only fighting 1 PD, they are all going to collapse on the center here. And his own missed Dust to Dust casts explode one of his horse, which explodes some more, and another Dust to Dust cast explodes the last one. So their fiery explosions do manage to kill the province defense commander, but he could have retaken that army without spending those fire gems in the process. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I prefer fire elementals to those guys, but they still do okay. Here in Melma, we successfully raid a province from Agartha with that army, which is most likely what Agartha was trying to hit. We lose a couple ghosts, but we get a couple soulless warriors thanks to our Shade Beast. Here in Renthale, we get to see Marienyon's army. So, what he's got here is mostly infantry troops, some of which are cursed from either fighting a cursing province defense dude. Here we go. Yeah, so this basically means that they have a higher chance of getting afflicted when they do take damage. And then he's got a bunch of these devils and fiends, some of which are cursed as well, so it's most likely just a result of a province that they've been sitting in, or a bad event hitting a province while this army was there. Mixing devils and fiends can cause the heat aura from the devils to hurt the fiends, but because this is a cold province, it's not likely to do all too much. He does have fire gems on these guys, and given their position, it's most likely the case that he's planning on having them summon fire elementals. So they could be scripted to burn a gem casting Phoenix power, and then another 2 to summon a full-size fire elemental, and while fairly expensive in terms of gems, given that it's 3 per mage, it's still oftentimes worth it, especially in a close fight, because those fire elementals are incredibly powerful against Lemuria. It's also possible that rather than having this guy cast flaming arrows, he's going to put up the battlefield-wide Phoenix Power ability, or the Phoenix Power spell, which is a spell that Submod adds, which is an F3 spell that costs 3 gems, that basically applies the Phoenix Power effect to all fire mages on the battlefield. So that would then save him at least 1 gem, but given that they're carrying 3, I don't think that that's the case, especially since he does have a bunch of crossbows and no other mage capable of casting it. This guy is obviously going to be doing anti-magic, given that he's got S2 and a bunch of pearls, and this guy's just carrying extra gems, it looks like. So yeah, so no wind guide here to go with his flaming arrows, and probably no elementals other than these guys here at the front, although this guy might also summon some. He's in a very awkward position to do that since it would likely get stuck behind the archers. However, given the fact that he has a bunch of these fiends and devils which have magic attacks on the tail for the devils and on both attacks for the fiends, this is a very dangerous army to fight against, and hopefully I can just hit it with Winds of Death, which can decay a bunch of those guys without risking my own units. Here in Ardun, our Scale Spammer takes a province. Here in Sailor's Haven, a bunch of demons take a province, although he loses a few Serpent Fiends in the process. Here in Plothai, so this is where our Wind of Death casters went. We had been trying to hit Marienyon's army with them, but instead we just hit some province defense. He does have a lot of province defense here, so it's actually kind of good that this is relatively heavy for a raiding party. And this kind of is going to help show the effects of Wind of Death. Even though it's not hitting an army, we can at least see the effects of the decaying being applied to a bunch of these troops. It would affect a smaller percentage of Marienyon's actual army if he was casting anti-magic round 1, but if he was pausing to cast Power of the Spheres first for whatever reason, then it would have just as high of a chance of affecting all of his Royal Guards, although it would still have a lower chance of affecting his Devils and Mages. So those white numbers are supposed to correspond to age, and you can kind of see that here under the fatigue, and whenever they get hit by the decaying thing, then their age goes up by 5 years. It doesn't seem to be totally accurate in that we've occasionally seen like inconsistent increases in the age of units, but so far nothing weird seems to be happening to these guys. So we saw one of them died from old age already. This one here is already suffering badly from it, and they're also fighting these souls, which are stalling them to allow the old age to kick in and slowly cause these guys to wither away. And with that, a sufficient number of the Indies died to force a rout. It's also the case, though, that decay kicks in after the end of the battle, which means that even units, or that even after your own guys have retreated, or in the case of these immortal guys just been overrun and killed, the units are going to continue to have their age tick up, and many of them are still going to die. So that's what I was trying to hit with his army with, but unfortunately I just hit some province defense instead. But at least I managed to raid a province off of him, so that's all good. Here I raid another province off of Agartha, losing a dispossessed spirit in the process. Here we see that because this was a battle at the fortress, that does mean that we won, since it only displays that message for successful storms. So my guys have these guys here at the front, just in order to take the initial hits. A bunch of crossbows in the middle just to try to shoot over the walls at his guys. Given that he has his guys all just blobbed up in the center, they most likely are just unscripted, so they're not going to be super effective. So the main spell which I'm using this battle, and the only battlefield spell that's going up, is Rigor Mortis. This is going to cause fatigue damage over time to all enemy units. So there is a I think a 50% chance of hitting a square and then causing 10 fatigue to that square. So many of these guys are going to be unaffected, and the fatigue isn't going to put them to sleep right away. However, it does build up rather quickly over time as more and more units fail or get hit by that effect. And because it doesn't affect undead, my own guys are not going to be bothered by it at all, except for my crossbowmen, who are going to be much less affected just by virtue of being ranged, and therefore not needing to have their fatigue go up further once they're in melee. In addition to the actual going to sleep effect once they hit 100 fatigue, units that have fatigue for every 10 points are going to have reduced attack and defense for their actual rolls, even though it doesn't actually show up on the unit. So that means that they're going to get less effective, so all of his guys are going to become worse and worse at fighting over the course of the fight, whereas my own ghosts are going to continue standing strong. So you can see here the effects of the Blood Vengeance on my guys. That was just a ton of javelins hitting, and you can see that lots of these guys actually did take damage from the B9 Bless. You can also see here that the Cloud of Death that this guy was casting, in spite of being a cloud effect, does still trigger Blood Vengeance, which is how this guy took some damage. He does have very high magic resistance though, but because the Cloud of Death is just hitting such a huge area, it has very many chances to trigger BV and therefore to cause him some damage. Because Cloud of Death does trigger at the start of his turn, so at the start of each of his turns we'll see if any of my guys are taking damage from that or not. So far it looks like this guy's been perfectly okay, whereas this guy has had some serious hardship thanks to that spell. Luckily with that, pretty much all of his sacreds are gone, which means that there's no more chance of my mage killing himself with his evocation. So that battle went very well. We basically lost only Chaff taking the fortress. We killed a bunch of Sacreds and a bunch of Spellcasters, who could have done some more damage, I think, if they'd been given some Blood Slaves, and potentially even more if they had managed to do some summoning in order to increase their front line. Since while my Ghosts were in that gate, they were getting hit with a ton of Banishment, which was able to do a lot of damage even without like an actual script. Here in Range of Shadow we get some gems. In Valdor we get more gems. In the Great Mountains, well, this is a minor negative effect. We don't care too much about the turmoil. And we get yet more gems from the Broken Mirror and the Hexwoods. And in Knobville, we've actually breached this fortress as well. So, given the success that we've had here, we're going to be claiming this throne here, the Throne of the Moon. The growth effect isn't going to help us out all too much, nor will the precision, but extra gems are nice, as will the Dominion spread over in this area. So even though it's like right next to Miklan's capital and is therefore unlikely to cause a Dom kill outright, we can at least start suppressing his Dominion, and maybe even eventually get that Dom kill, given that he needs to spend slaves in order to sacrifice. These guys managed to take their province, but they also spent their gems in the process, so we need to have them sneak back to a lab in order to re-up on gems, in order to go back to their Wind of Death antics. Given that I don't think that he wants this army to get hit by Wind of Death, I expect him to start to extract it, although he might still try standing on that fortress again, as he did a while back. With Agartha having retaken these provinces over here, we're going to slip down over here, which his guys can't get to, except for from this fort here, and then start re-raiding this area over here. Following Jomin's major defeat in the battle here in the Misty Forest, a couple turns back, and the fact that we've managed to get a whole bunch more Ghosts to reinforce this army, we're going to then move on to this castle over here, and potentially storm it to get those awesome Air and Astral Mages. Given Jomin's fantastic defeat over here, both of us lost a bunch of chaff in the process, but as Lemuria, mine is fundamentally replaceable, so I'm right back at it, while he's going to need a lot of time to rebuild, and may in fact never get the chance to get back to his former strength. Having seen this army right over here, and the fact that Miklan hasn't been using his mages very effectively, we are going to go for the storm effect, or going for the storm attempt. You can see here I'm doing a similar thing where I have like a spread out group here at the front, and then forming sort of a bowl to get a surround on his guys. That's because I'm expecting him to attack into me with this blob of Sacreds. These guys are going to be mostly just going for skeleton spam and apostasy. This guy's going to cast Resist Magic, which is going to increase his magic resistance by a little bit, and then try spamming Nether Darts. Nether Darts is a great evocation spell, hits a large number of targets, and it can reduce the magic resistance of targets hit by causing Feeble Mind in an area around it. While Feeble Mind does reduce attack and defense by a little bit, its main effect is removing magic past our mages, so if any mages do get caught, they are essentially rendered useless, and reducing the magic resistance of units by a lot. And that's actually important because all of my guys have that magic resistance negated attack. We can see here that Atlantis is charging forward once again with an army, and this time they have been properly supported with supply items, which we know because they have been talking about it publicly, that Miklan has been sending supply items to Atlantis, so we can't expect him to march forward and get onto our fort. I have a ton of mages in here, and I'm generating like lots and lots of packs of wolves, the idea being that I can essentially hold up my fort indefinitely if his army does get through. However, because I do just, have a ton of mages, it's also definitely possible that I can just win the fight conventionally, just by virtue of having superior mage support. Although we'll need to wait and see what his army looks like before actually taking that risk. Luckily, we'll get a couple chances since he'll have to first take this, and then get onto a fort, so I might even have a chance to trigger gem spending before actually taking the fight. So Miklan is essentially falling. We will be capturing some of his forces, capturing some of his fortresses. We've already broken a bunch of his armies, and while he still does have a ton of sacreds and a fair number of mages, so he's like not helpless by any means, he's definitely taking a beating. Atlantis, meanwhile, having quelled most of my raiding parties, is essentially in full control of the oceans once again, and is basically back on top with his economy while still having a large army that's then barreling towards me. The fact that he hasn't responded with raiding of his own is definitely helpful for me, because like just, a bunch of different groups of those magic warrior guys, of those magic weapon guys, like spread out across my territory, just hitting a bunch of my provinces, would be very difficult to deal with. But because he hasn't done that and is instead using these isolated doom balls, his damage against me is actually relatively small. So Atlantis could definitely be doing a lot more to hurt me, but he still remains most likely my greatest immediate threat, just on account of the size of that army. Agartha, meanwhile, because he's focusing largely on conquering Abyssia over here, is still relatively vulnerable in his own territory, so I'm managing to siege his fort. I've got all these raiding parties running around, capturing stuff that had once been Joman's, and hitting stuff that's essentially at the heart of his empire. Although, given that he's just, has a bunch of troops in the area and a lot of mages, it's most likely going to be limited damage, but it is at least keeping him down somewhat. And given that he's otherwise most likely the front runner for this game, the more damage that I can do to Agartha, the better. And that's the turn. This is turn 42 of Degeneracy. So first we claim the throne from that fortress which we'd captured off of Mictlan last turn. We see that a global enchantment was put up. This is Mother Oak. It gives 10 nature gems per turn and costs 50 nature gems to put up. It's a relatively low-level enchantment at only Alteration 5, and since we know that Atlantis has N9 on his Pretender, that's most likely who cast it. So it has a decently high base overcast just from the extra paths on the Pretender, since it gets an extra 5 gems for its overcast per point in the path above the level of the spell. So since it's an N9 caster casting an N5 spell, it gets basically 20 extra gems, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to dispel if someone does want to dispel it. Here in Pantocrator's Bounty, we see Atlantis' army. As expected, he is sending just one big ol' stack of guys at me. We can see here a couple of things. First, he's got these guys, which are ethereal, vitriol breath shooting green lions. So vitriol breath is an area of effect ranged attack. It's not particularly precise, but the chassis that it's on is fairly precise, which means that it has a decent chance of hitting even without any buffs. With Wind Guide, it becomes much better. It's relatively short range at range 13, but it hits an area of effect, so there's no way to resist it with shields. It deals magic damage, and it applies corrosion, which means that it's going to be breaking armor. For my units, the corrosion effect is generally not a huge deal, since they don't really have armor to begin with, but since it is a magic AoE 1 effect, it's basically going to kill a square of ghosts each time they shoot. These guys are mindless, so they have 50 morale, which means that they never rout. The fact that they're ethereal isn't a huge deal since I'm using primarily magic weapons anyways, but it will make them a little bit more resilient against crossbows and skeleton spam. Where these guys really shine is when they can have some protection buffs applied to them, and things like Wind Guide casts so that they can be more accurate, and when they have something to go in front of them to take the initial fire, so that they can first use all of their ranged shots before they go into melee. Once they're in melee, they're still fairly resilient, and they also have 2 attacks each, and at size 3 that means that they're 4 attacks per square, and they just have decent stats with 16 strength and 14 attack. So they're just all-around really strong units, particularly when they are actually shooting with their acid breath. He's actually frontlining with these guys, which I don't think is the correct play. I would actually prefer to have some of these guys in the fight first, before the Green Lions enter combat, just so that they can get a chance to do all of their shooting. So he's putting all of his diseased Arthurtuts in the front. That's most likely just so that he can get rid of them. It looks like he's got a bunch of diseased, or at least a couple of diseased Iced Warriors as well. But these guys are not regenerating, so they're going to die eventually anyways. I think these are just starving guys from his last campaign. Because these guys have N9, they're going to regenerate, which means that they won't actually die on their own, so he's putting them in the front just to get rid of them. But these guys do have worse combat stats than his guys in general. If he does want to be using his green lines in melee, the things that I would be doing differently is I would definitely put them behind the disease guys, so that they can be shooting while the chap that you will actually want to die actually engages first. And then I would also make sure to be able to apply some sort of buffs to them. So this guy is D3 with a Skull Staff. If he actually had Death Gems, I would assume Stygian Reigns or something. He's definitely not going to be casting Rigor Mortis against me. This guy's got a Skull Staff as well. These guys might be set up for Wither Bones casting. This guy's got a water booster, so that might be Cleansing Waters. These guys, let's see what they're doing. So Effigy of War is interesting in that it makes something appear larger, but it's not like particularly useful in combat. It just applies an effect that can trick scouts and make your army look scarier than it is. He's bringing a bunch of water bottles and these skull talismans. I'm not sure what the point of putting a skull talisman is on a Tungalik, because they can cast Raise Dead anyways, or they can create skeletons one at a time anyways, so they can basically do the same spell that you get with that amulet. The other thing is that his water bottles are kind of all just stuck behind his guys. Because these guys, or the water bottles, come back at the end of each fight, you usually want to have them actually fighting first, because if they die, it doesn't cause any permanent losses amongst your troops. And given that he's got all these skull talismans, I would definitely try to recruit like some indie commanders or something, or just some scouts, and then have those guys carry the water bottles and skull talismans, and then that way you can also position them like on the flanks of your army without actually having the mages waste their turns using the skull talisman spell when they can cast spells of their own. And it would also help by making sure that the elementals can get into the fight more quickly, and the same would be true for the skeletons, which as battle summons you want to be basically getting into the fight while your troops are still alive. And then, of course, he's doing the line formation crossbow thing, which is kind of bad for targeting reasons, but we've been over that a couple times. But mostly, yeah, the positioning error is just getting these guys all bunched up behind his guys, where the cold aura from the elementals is going to freeze his not cold-resistant crossbowmen, and the elementals can't be doing any trampling while they're stuck behind his troops. Here in the Black Peaks, we're able to take this fortress, well, the fortress province, I should say, from Jomon, no problem. He doesn't really have any defense, so we just lose a couple of our very frontline guys, and the fort is under siege. Here in Nobville, this is Miklin's attempt to kick us off the fort. So he's bringing a large blob of sacreds and a bunch of demons. So, of particular note, I have just a bunch of crossbows and ghosts. He has just a bunch of sacreds and demons. The demons would be scarier if he had been using fiends or other demons with magic attacks. Because these guys don't have any, my ghosts are going to be able to hold them off quite just fine. And my crossbows are going to be great against his unarmored jaguars. And you can see that a couple of these have already been killed in their human form and turned into were-jaguar form. He had these demons just fly directly into combat, where they surround my ghosts. But the ghosts don't particularly care, and they are now going to be surrounded by ghost skeletons and crossbows. So, worth noting, my initial casts of nether darts had no chance of actually killing my guy, because it was all being shot at the, they're all being shot at the, demons who did not have blood vengeance on, aside from the Ozelotls, so he was able to help kill those without actually killing himself. But once he started shooting nether darts into this big blob of infantry, even with resist magic cast on himself, he did enough damage to himself to actually kill himself from the blood vengeance. So I did lose a mage doing that, so it was kind of unfortunate. However, we did get rid of all these demons, and the nether darts were actually very effective against them, so that was definitely worth casting. So you can see here that these a bunch of these guys were paralyzed from the Shadow Soldiers and their paralyzed attack. And the other thing, which is basically just what made this fight go well in general, is that I was able to get all of my guys attacking all at once, while he kind of isn't. So like these guys are in a box formation, and many of these guys in the box are just not actually engaging at all, whereas my guys are spread all across the front of his line, and they're actually all attacking and getting even some flank shots in. The guys in the second row were able to fire their javelins off first, so they were not completely wasted at all. Many of these crossbows actually took a lot of blood vengeance damage, and that actually did make some of these guys even rout, and you can see that these guys here are running away. So one squad of my crossbows just hurt themselves enough from the BV to just rout themselves, but they were able to do definitely enough damage in the process to be well worth it, because these jaguars are much more expensive than the crossbows, and being unarmored and all, they were taking a lot of damage from these ranged attacks. And with that, his army is routed, thanks in part to the fact that these guys were able to get around the large jaguar squad, given that they'd broken through the line formation of jaguars, and the box formation was all stuck fighting just a couple ghosts to their north, and they were able to get rid of Miklin's commander. And the rest of their guys are mostly able to escape. You can see that here, that 23 of the jaguar warriors survived, but were able to kill the Miklin priest and rout the King of Rain. We lost mostly chaff in the process, but we did lose one of our Lemur acolytes and a bunch of crossbowmen just from the blood vengeance, so that was definitely a very powerful effect there. But yeah, I mean, you can see here that he had a massive troop quality advantage, and he even had a little bit of a mage advantage, given that this guy is one of his big cap-only mages. However, just based on the fact that I was able to concentrate my forces better than him and get more of my guys attacking consistently, especially since he had his demons split off so they were fighting before his jaguars were, so that meant that I was actually able to carry the fight with, I think, actually a somewhat weaker army. Here in the Great Dunes, we see Marienyon's army withdraw. They actually withdrew to the northwest rather than directly back into the province which my Grand Lemurs had raided. The reason that they did that was that if my Grand Lemurs had a scout with them to give them extra death gems to re-up on the Wind of Death casting, I most likely would have moved back down into Marienyon's army, and then, tried to once again snipe them with that Wind of Death thing. So that was basically just trying to dodge the battlefield clear thing. I'm able to raid a province that didn't have any PD, so that was nice. Here in Jaburnia, we raid a province successfully with our Shade Beasts getting a couple Soulless Warriors to boost up our army. Here in Dural Woods, our Skella Spammer is once again able to take another province, no problems there. We forgot to put PD in Melma. Oh wait, no, actually that was one of Agartha's forts, so he was able to retake that when my army moved away. I could have left a ghost there just to see what he breaks siege with, but there wasn't really much point given that we saw the armies in the area, so it doesn't tell us much to see what he's going to be sending. Here in Pescan, we're able to successfully raid this army, which had a ton of these turtle warriors, which is what Agartha was using to go underwater. But there's essentially not really much in the way of mage support, since he's just using these guys as Skell Spammers, so my huge number of ghosts was able to just run over them. Here in the Great Mountain, Gartha's once again just using these reanimators, leading blind fighters and crossbows. They don't have excellent leadership, but they do have decent leadership, like essentially the same as an indie commander, so these guys are actually fine leading troops on their own. Here in Koramu, we're able to take a province off of Agartha with just some raiding ghosts. Here in Plothai, this is once again Marienyon just raiding back a province using a couple fiends, which are most likely being led by this adept here. But this is just like a raiding group essentially. It's larger than perhaps a regular raiding group should be, but given how much trouble my 1 PD has caused to everyone, I can see why he would want to do that. And then here we were able to take Nobville. We can see that based on the thing that it says that it was a battle at the fortress, same as last turn. And this is the province which we had actually just fought Miklin's army on earlier. You can see that some of his guys actually retreated into his fort, which is why he even has some of these Jaguar warriors here. But because they retreated in, they're completely unscripted. However, because I actually did have a bunch of my guys rout from the end of that last battle, I have relatively few guys here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how I actually managed to win this regardless. So he summons up some imps, they fly in with the Ozlotl, but the flying guys get ganked pretty much instantly. Oh, and these guys have these Frighten helmets. Let's see. these things. So this is actually auto-casting Frighten every turn. It's not a great spell, but it definitely synergizes well with the Fear aura from this ghost right over here. And if there are like sufficiently small squads or individual commanders that get tagged by that, then they definitely have a chance of routing. My Prophet has very low hit points on account of being an enemy dominion, but luckily he has unequaled obesity. He is just the fattest ghost that ever ate, or something, which means that he's still able to have an okay HP pool, in spite of being in deep enemy dominion. So I'm just going to show the squares here just so we can see if apostasy is ever actually successful here. It looks like for the most part my apostasy is not successful at all. However, his guys are basically just running into the battlefield summons from my Raise Dead and Reanimate Skeletons, so these guys are definitely being very effective. My crossbow squad does rout, so that's unfortunate, and then my actual ghostly guys are able to move through the walls because they're ethereal, and just go right around the jaguars. So that one apostasy was successful, but these guys were able to kill that Mechlin priest right away before I was able to get to keep him. Not that I think it would actually be all too valuable to have, since I can't really blood hunt, but I would be able to blood hunt his lands a little bit and potentially make some blood items, so it would have been nice to have, but it's not like the end of the world that I was not able to keep him. And we can see here that many of these priests are already routing, thanks to the fact that they were actually stuck in melee, so some of them were able to take little bits of damage. And you can see here that they were able to cast the melee range blood spell Leeching Touch, and were able to both kill the guys in that square there and heal themselves in the process. However, many of their friends are already running away, as are all of the Jaguar Warrior frontliners, which means that the battlefield summons from the Horde of Skeletons and Raised Dead are able to move through the gate to attack them, and the ghosts are already basically on top of them. And because this is a fortress fight, everything that retreats dies, so that is a total wipe for 15 Mechlin Priests and a Nahuali. I did lose one of my Shadow Tribunes and some more of my crossbows and free spawn, but I managed to keep both of my Fear Aura Ghosts alive, and I actually get to capture the fortress, which is, of course, by far the biggest deal. So, with these ghostly reinforcements here, I'm able to group up with the guys who had just taken this fort and move in over here. These guys are largely just reanimating to rebuild my losses here. I'm going to be building a temple as well, so between the temple and this Thrones Spread Dominion effect, I should be able to get rid of Mechlin's Dom in this area. I imagine that he's going to be bloodsacking to push that Dom right back, but for now, I'll definitely be able to push back at least a little bit. Here I am basically just going to reinforce this fortress a little bit. This one here is basically just going to be full of wolves, so it's going to be very difficult for him to breach. Regardless, because of the positioning of his army, I should actually be able to beat it with a mix of Lizard Shaman Mage support and some of my own Death Mages. So I'll basically just need to watch out to see how quickly he takes down the walls, given that he does just have a large number of guys, and then possibly move mages and additional troops over this way in order to see if I can take him down. I'm going to be retaking this province over here with just a relatively small raiding party of guys, so just like a couple ghosts, while most of them stay inside the fortress to make sure that he can't take it with this army. Because these guys don't have gems, they're going to be sneaking over, but this fort does not actually have a lab, which means that they're not going to be able to restock quite yet, and I do need to actually sneak them further into my territory. This thing over here does have a temple, so it would be nice to actually protect it. But because I need to worry about Atlantis' army right over here, I can't really focus on taking out this army from Marienyon, and I would actually need a ton of mages and a lot of ghosts in order to beat it. So given that I need to focus on fighting one army at a time, I'm more worried about fighting Atlantis' Doomstack rather than Marienyon's. Similarly over here, I do need to worry about taking on this army from Jomon, which was able to re-up thanks to his high production. Because I have a ton of province defense over here, and I'm not sure what all is in this army, and if you'll recall, while we were able to kill a bunch of Jomon's mages, many of them did escape. So between all of that, I do want to be able to basically be at my best when we're fighting. So I'm grouping up over here with both the army which was on this fort right over here, and these mercenaries, Grom's Brave Breakers. And then that way they'll be able to fight with the province defense which I'd purchased to beat Jomon's army previously, as well as the reinforcements from right over here. This guy, my pretender, is going to be cloud trapezing to Ampholia, I believe casting Rain of Stones? Let's see what she's casting. Oh, Wind of Death, Rain of Stones, yes. So she's going to be cloud trapezing, let's see where that is. I don't actually remember. I might just be extracting her. I know that we're definitely not sending her anywhere outside of our dominion, basically ever. Oh yeah, so we're moving her over here. So the idea is that if he moves his army over here to attack this temple province, because it's in my friendly dominion, my pretender is going to, because she's immortal, she's definitely not going to die, and because she has the ability to cast both Wind of Death and Rain of Stones, she's going to be throwing up both battlefield clear spells to potentially take out his army. We saw that he didn't have any battlefield-wide protection buffs. Many of these crossbows are quite squishy, as are his mages, so if he runs into that trap, then he's liable to lose a bunch of mages in the process, and I can't really lose anything other than the temple, which would be destroyed anyways, because my pretender is immortal, so she's just going to respawn back in our capital. So that's what I'm doing to potentially help deal with Marienyon's army rather than trying to take it on directly. So basically continuing to do the same thing that I had been doing with the Wind of Death battlefield clear, but more direct using my pretender as well. Following the success of this fort right over here, I'm going to be looking to basically secure my domination over Mictlan by capturing these provinces over here, and then start looking to raid into Atlantis once again through these sea provinces right over here. That will potentially also let me get the opportunity to flank him from all along this edge right over there. But we'll see when we actually get to that whether or not I can actually pull off a flank. So I'm basically going to first watch out for this army right over here, see what I can do about defending my forts, and then depending on what or how well he is able to actually siege the fort, I'll kick him off right away, or let him sit for a little while, see if some additional diseases if we can't get some additional diseases to build up from any starvation, if he miscalculated how many supply items he'd brought. Well, meanwhile, down over here, we're preparing to intercept Jomon's army. If he does move onto the fort, then we'll at least be able to see what it has, because we're leaving one of our shadows behind. And if he moves over here, then we'll at least be fighting it at as full strength as possible. As far as Agartha goes, we're going to be trying to siege this fort right over here. The reason for that is that this way it basically gives us an opportunity to move into more different provinces, with all three of these being available. And because we can see what's inside this fort, we know that it doesn't have a huge number of defenders, so it should be relatively safe to hit. It would also have been safe to hit this forest province right over here, but this gives us a little bit more leeway about where to go, and provides a little bit more harassment because it stops him from recruiting a mage during the turn that the fort is under siege. Similarly, these guys are going to be moving up into here. Because we know that he's been kind of just keeping his army on this fort over here, potentially expecting me to try to send a raiding party from this fort, it's unlikely that he's going to be able to move troops in to defend it, and we know that Marienyon isn't, because he isn't going to want to attack Agartha and potentially get a bump there. And that's the turn.